figure out how this light goes on. Well, thank you all very much. What a wonderful film and a great start for our last session. Poetry beginning both sessions. That's pretty good, right? I want to just take a moment to thank the Rockefeller Foundation for their great help, getting this organized starting 4 or 5 years ago and making such an impact as they have, and Sam Myers and company for being the lead on this. So to the two of you and all of you, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to be able to be engaged in this. Yesterday in Washington, it was about 92 degrees. It was unbelievably hot in every way. As we gathered, the numbers of people pouring in was really impressive. And coming out of that day yesterday, I felt I'd not seen anything quite like this, anything that underlined as much as yesterday the sense of urgency of where we are, until beginning with that panel here this morning, where we also got a great sense of the interconnected nature of the challenges that we all face. The mission, it seems to me, is very nicely organized. One of the core tenets of planetary health is that we need a new relationship between humanity and Earth's natural systems, and such a shift can only occur with an activated global public. That's what we want to talk about today, is this, in the remaining session, an activated global public and how we go about doing that. I've been in politics most of my life, and most of that has revolved around a growing theory of change. For most of my lifetime and most of your lifetime, our sense of how change came about was from the top down. That if we provided the right kind of leadership framework and the right kind of people on the ballot and provided science to people and had good press and good information going out, that people would understand that, they would look at that, they'd read it. We could focus our time and effort organizing increasingly in the last 15 years, say, on the grass tops. And it was from that we would arrive at the sorts of changes that our globe needs. I think we've now come to understand that is a really inadequate model and not an approach that's going to get us from here to the urgent future that we all would like to see. Rather, change in the United States has not come about because of top-down grass tops movement. It's come about from the bottom up. If you think about everything that has gone on of real note, I think, in our lifetimes, if you look at the civil rights movement, look at what's happened in women's empowerment in the country, think about the environmental movement, the Cuyahoga River and the Channel in California, look at Ralph Nader and the consumer revolution. These are all items that did not begin by top-down activities, but they all began because people organized to make a change, organized because they felt a set of shared goals. How we organize, how we relearn this lesson, and how we take advantage of the extraordinary momentum that is out there, both because we have better information, but also because we understand the urgency of the political situation in which we find ourselves, and people are responding. How do we organize to take advantage of that? That's what we want to talk about this morning. We're privileged to have as our opening speaker Marshall Gans. Probably few people in the country have a better understanding of how change has occurred and how mobilizations occur than Marshall, teaching at the Kennedy School with a long history and background. So Marshall, you're our lead person. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. All right, good. You got to get okay, thank you. No, thank you for the opportunity to work with you this morning. And I've been asked to speak about leading change, organizing, and action. Let me just start by reflecting on the fact that in 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville visiting the United States, wrote, "In a democracy, knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all forms of knowledge. On it depends all others." Attending to the role of civic groups, churches, political parties, he argued that association was what could draw people out of their narrow individualism into a broader understanding of common interests that were required for democracy to work. The fact that associations that he lifted up were voluntary meant they could also be a source of renewal for the civic values on which a healthy polity depends. And the democratic promise, in turn, is that the combination of equal voices can, to some extent, command the political resources to balance domination of those with greater economic resources. Making democracy work, in other words, requires not just the protection of individual liberties, but the creation of collective capacity. And that's what organizers do, is create collective capacity. Rooted in an understanding of leadership as enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty, a challenge to the hands in terms of skills, a challenge to the head in terms of concepts and strategy, and a challenge to the heart in terms of courage and the motivation and urgency to act. They ask three questions. First, who are my people? Who are the people with whom I am to engage in exercising leadership for shared purpose? Second, what is their experience of the challenge? How is the challenge understood in terms of their own lived experience? And therefore, what is the change they perceive they need? And thirdly, how can they use their resources in new ways to create the power they need to achieve that change? In other words, it's not a concept of providing services to clients. It's not a concept of marketing products to customers. It is engaging with people as a community to become a constituency. And constituency comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. In other words, it is about bringing people together to learn together, to decide together, to act together, and to win together. And that's what organizing is about. And it's not something brand new. That certainly not invented at the Kennedy School, God knows. But actually, the first story I heard of organizing was actually in the book of Exodus, which was about a journey from slavery to freedom that a set of people undertook. It's actually deeply rooted in faith traditions, or when the Greeks decided they didn't need kings to govern themselves, a civic tradition. Or when the Irish tenant farmers of a British landlord decided that they could get improvements on their land that he was refusing to do if they withheld their products long enough, they won, and his name was Captain Boycott. Now, yes, that's where we get it, Captain Boycott. My point is that this approach to change is rooted in faith, in civic traditions, and in popular action, and has been for thousands of years all around the world. Now, in the U.S., in particular, organizing has driven the great social movements that have been the ongoing, if episodic, sources of accountability, renewal, and change, whether from the left or the right or the middle. Crippled by fragmented, and this, I guess I don't have to make this case so much now, crippled by fragmented public institutions, a result of a need to protect slavery in one part of the country and encourage freedom in another, which went into the formulation of the American Constitution. There is a result of a very limited majoritarian democracy, meaning things like the Electoral College. Government has rarely been the source of the initiation of change from within. On the other hand, the impulse for change, ever since the Great Awakening, the 1840s or even before, has played out more in the form of great movements of moral reform. They're not random. They emerge from the efforts of purposeful actors, individuals, and organizations to assert new public values, form relationships rooted in those values, and mobilize political, economic, and cultural power to translate those values into action. They're not fashions or fads. They're collective, they're strategic, And they differ from interest groups in that they're not simply about reallocating goods, but they are also about redefining what a good is. Not content with winning the game, they try to change the rules of the game. So since the American Revolution itself, organized by Sam Adams and his Sons of Liberty, temperance, abolition, suffrage, agrarian reform, labor reform, racial reform, gender reform, environmental reform, and yes, the conservative reform movements have been driven by social movements. They begin as insurgents, they influence parties, they shape public policy. And interestingly, they seem to develop in such a way that they combine local action with national purpose. They're able to integrate local rootedness with state and national or regional focus and strategy. Otherwise, we wind up like in D.C. with a lot of heads with no bodies, or in local communities with bodies with no heads. And it's that integration that makes things work. Actually, E.E. Schneider, great American political science, said elites always try to localize conflict. And so insurgents always have to figure out how to redefine the turf so that they're in a place that they can then maximize their resources and bring those to bear. In time, they also shape themselves as campaigns. Stephen Jay Gould wrote about the two ways of understanding time. He said, time is a cycle, that's the rhythm of continuity. Time is an arrow. He said that's the rhythm of change, episodic, focused, intense. That's what we mean by a campaign. It's not just an electoral campaign. It's an intense stream of activity that creates capacity in the course of pursuing the goal. So that we, for example, we recruit volunteers. Now we can go out and identify voters. Now we can go out and persuade those voters. It is a scaled way of building the road as we walk it and as we learn in the course of it how better to do it. Now, leadership is at the heart of a movement. Who accepts the responsibility to enable others to achieve this purpose under conditions of uncertainty? Now, there are 5 practices that are central to this practice or to this way of thinking of leadership and organizing, and I'll just indicate them. There won't be a lot of time to discuss, perhaps on Q&A. The first is relationship building. Now, relational work is foundational for the reasons de Tocqueville was talking about it. Relational work is how individuals, it's not the aggregation of individual resources, but rather the creation of collective capacity that makes a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that begins in relational work, one-on-one work, community work, people connecting with each other. Because relationships, unlike contracts, don't end an exchange, they begin one. Because relationships grow and change. So while they're transactional, they can be transformational if commitments are made to them as foundational for work that we will do together. So this is also one of the critical differences between mobilizing and organizing. These days there's been a lot of mobilizing because social media has made it very cheap to mobilize. Get the word out, show up in this place, aggregate a whole lot of individuals, and then it all goes away. And what happens? I don't know. In Tahrir Square, they did a very good job of mobilizing. They didn't build the organizational structure to turn the mobilization to strategic purpose. And so who walked away with the benefits? The folks with the organization. The Muslim Brothers in that case, and ultimately the army. My point is that there was a time when to produce those numbers, you had to build structure and leadership and depth to do it. Now it seems easy to do it, so we get a protest, but it never turns to power. And the real challenge here is how to turn protest to power. And that's what organizing is all about, beginning in the forming of those lateral relationships with each other so that we begin to act together. The second is tapping into the emotional resources, because this is a head, heart, hands proposition, into the emotional resources to counter to, on the one hand, create urgency. And I think one of the great challenges in this movement has been how to make the important urgent, because the urgent will always count. But then how to create the urgency, but at the same time, the hope to counter fear, the empathy to counter alienation, the sense of self-worth to counter self-doubt. One of the major mechanisms through which we do that is the use of narrative, of storytelling. Because what stories do, they tap into the emotional resources in our values, what Charles Taylor calls our moral values, to find those sources of hope and empathy and self-worth, and on the basis of that, respond to these challenges with agency and not with fear, whether as individuals or in communities. So the role of storytelling and of public narrative, as we call it, linking my story with our story, with the urgent challenge we face in this moment that requires action, is a second critical dimension. The third critical dimension is strategizing, how to turn what we have into what we need to get what we want. Strategy. Something we do every day, just like storytelling, just like relationship building. The reason I mention these as distinct practices are that they can be focused on, that we can take what we understand implicitly, make it explicit, and in that way become purposeful and intentional about it. It also makes the point, though, that organizing is not some esoteric thing known by a few of the inner circle, but is actually something everyone is capable of. And that's the point. That's where its power lies. So strategizing about how to turn what we have into what we need to get what we want is how to translate our resources into power. And power is a pretty clear concept. If you need my resources more than I need your resources, who's got the power? Let me ask it again. You need what I got more than I need what you got. Who got the power? You. All right, now we understand power. Power is not a thing. It's a relationship of influence. And so the question is to understand the interdependencies around us so as to find our points of leverage to create that influence. And most simply put, the Montgomery bus boycott that started the modern civil rights movement in the United States was based on people discovering that, in fact, they all had critical resources that could become a source of power. Those critical resources, what were they? They all had feet. And if they used their feet to walk to work instead of getting on the bus, denying the bus company their bus fare, if they all did it together, this individual resource could become a source of collective power. It took a year, and they won. That's what the American colonists understood when they dumped tea into Boston Harbor here as well. So this... Oh, I'm getting the signal here. We can talk more about power later. That was a very subtle thing. Now you know where the power really lies. See, this is... All right. The fourth, so we'll come back to strategy and power. We can talk about that, David and Goliath. Structure is the fourth. Movements often occur in reaction to oppressive structures they experience as oppressive. So their reaction is to say, we want no structure. But then you get into what feminist sociologist Joe Freeman called the tyranny of structurelessness. Which is we have no formal structure, but we're all, there's no leadership here. Instead, what we have is off-the-book structure with factions and lack of transparency. And maybe you've never had this experience, but I think a lot of us have. And so the point is to take charge of governing ourselves. And what we've been doing a great deal of work with is with leadership teams and with forms of distributed leadership that actually act to scaffold leadership development rather than suppressing it through the one leader, everybody does what that one leader says model. We think we can do much more rich work in that area. Finally is action, because all this doesn't add up unless it turns into votes, people, facts on the ground. And that requires eliciting the commitment, because you don't buy people's commitment. You have to motivate it. You have to elicit it. And it comes through not making things easy, but making them significant. When I was working for the farm workers movement, we convinced millions of people not to eat grapes as a boycott of grapes to get contracts with grape growers in California. It was not that it was so easy, but it was significant. Adding up, it mattered. That's what happened in Montgomery. So thinking about how to combine accessibility and commitment into accessibility and significance into forms of action is a lot of where the action lies. So I think I'll just conclude now. Those are the 5 practices. Now, it feels a little bit like Will Rogers, who once called a press conference. He had a solution to the German submarine problem in the war. And they said, well, what is it? He said, well, we just boil the ocean, and then they'll all come up, and then we shoot them down. And they said, Mr. Rogers, how do we boil the ocean? He said, well, look, I gave you the answer. You work out the details. I feel like I've just done a little bit of that. But let me just conclude with 3 important questions to ask yourself that I always ask myself as foundational for this work. First, these are 3 questions posed by a first-century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who said, ask yourself first, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? It begins by taking responsibility. It's not about selfishness, but it is about the recognition of responsibility. Second, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize our interdependence and our relationality with everyone else in terms of their objectives as well as our own. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but appreciation of the fact to avoid what Jane Addams called the snare of preparation. Change only begins with action, and in reality, learning how to make the change we want only will flow from taking action. In other words, understanding doesn't precede it, it flows from it. So I invite you to join the action. Thank you.
Marshall, we could spend all day here with you. That was absolutely terrific. Change comes from action. Local action with national purpose. Our next speaker has developed an organization that is precisely that, local action with national purpose. Probably as well trained as anybody that I know. Kelsey Worth is a graduate of Harvard and the Stanford Business School, has a very, very successful medical technology background, and is now the founder and chairman of Mothers Out Front for Climate Action. Kelsey.
Thank you. I would just say that my training, my most valuable training, came from Marshall Gans, who is the inspiration for Mothers Out Front, and I think you got a very good sense from his remarks just how inspiring he is. So hopefully that will come through in the presentation this morning. Mothers Out Front. Mothers Out Front is building a movement of mothers. We are focused on climate change and a rapid and swift and complete transition from dirty to clean energy. We are not an advocacy group. We do not advocate on behalf of mothers and their children. We enable and activate mothers, and we do that by building their leadership. There's been a certain amount of talk here at this conference on how to move science into policy, and my guess is that that is a focus of just about everybody sitting in this room. And what I would venture to say is that there's a missing piece here, which is that without an organized and activated constituency, that's missing a Y, you're not going to get there. So right now, when it comes to climate change, the most organized and activated constituency happens to be the fossil fuel industry, and that is a problem. We happen to focus on mothers. Why mothers? First of all, we're everywhere. There are actually 80 million of us around the country. We vote. We have extraordinary purchasing power. We have very powerful social networks. We are fundamentally wired to protect our children. We happen to enjoy working together, and we have been an important force in past social movements. How does one build an active constituency of mothers? The revolution will not be tweeted. This is funny, but it's also true, as Marshall just said. So our approach, taking a chapter out of Marshall Gans' organizing, is to organize mothers at the community level. Our organizing is rooted in community. It is relationship-based. It is motivated by shared values around the desire and determination to protect our children. We are volunteer-led. We are very strategic in the work that we do. And the result of that is that we get deep and sustained commitment among the mothers that get involved. They're in it for the long haul, and we achieve concrete outcomes in our work. So just put a little bit differently, we form teams at the community, statewide, and national levels, and throughout that entire process, we invest very heavily in developing the leadership of the mothers who become part of Mothers Out Front. So that all sounds really good, and the question is, how long does that take? We are facing the urgency of climate change, and how many mothers does it take to actually make change happen? I'm going to take you through a quick case study on our Massachusetts campaign focused on gas leaks. Here in Massachusetts, we've been organizing for 4 years. That's how old Mothers Out Front is. We were founded 4 years ago right here. In 4 years, we have built 4,500 supporters. We have 15 community teams across the state of Massachusetts, and we have 350 active volunteers who give us about anywhere between 1 and 3 hours a week of their time on average. So our gas leaks campaign, it started with a Boston Globe article about a Harvard study indicating that the leaks were 2 to 3 times worse than anybody had expected. We pay for the gas that's leaked, and by the way, these leaks, if stopped, could heat 200,000 homes in Boston. So it's an incredible waste of our resources. So what do we do as an organization? We went out, our mothers went out and learned the facts about gas leaks. We teamed up with allies, of which we have many across the state of Massachusetts, and we went to work. We worked at every level. We worked at the community level, we worked at the city level, and we worked at the state level, recognizing that change at each one of those levels was essential if we were going to actually make something significant happen. This is critically important. Maps were the key. They were the magic potion in terms of enabling our organizing to happen. It was a key organizing tool because we have maps of where every gas leak in every town and city in Massachusetts is. And armed with these maps, you can make a lot of things happen. So our community teams went out. We met with elected officials. We said, hey, did you know that your city is plagued by these gas leaks, and look at where they are. We met with our neighbors and our friends, and we said, did you know that you have gas leaks right around the corner from your house and from your children's school? We convinced towns and city councils to pass resolutions in support of statewide legislation. We got a lot of publicity, and we went out and we physically tagged all the gas leaks in towns and cities across the states. We convinced 37 towns and cities to pass resolutions in support of statewide legislation. We showed up at hearings. This is what we do. We're mothers, and we show up. And the city council in Boston had never seen anything like this. Tito Jackson, who's currently running for mayor, said, I don't want my 8-year-old friends to have to deal with this. We will be held accountable by mothers out front, by mothers in the back, and by mothers on the side. We have 360 degrees of accountability. In December, we had 130 mothers out in freezing cold weather. We had 3 city council members show up, and we went out and we tagged all the leaks across Boston. We were not able to get a meeting with National Grid, one of the largest utilities in the state. Up until then, by the end of the day, we were trending number 2 on Twitter across the state, supported by mothers everywhere, not just in Boston, but all across the state, and some even outside of Massachusetts. And by the end of the day, Marcy Reed, the president of National Grid, was tweeting back saying, oh, of course we'll meet with you. And at the end of last year, the mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, signed the most aggressive gas leaks ordinance into law in the state of Massachusetts. One of our allies from Clean Water Action said, we've been working on gas leaks for a few years, but when Mothers Out Front got involved, it was as if the Army arrived. So we're working with all the 3 state utilities on a new way to identify the largest emitting gas leaks. 7% of the gas leaks are responsible for about 50% of the state's greenhouse methane emissions. We're working at the state level on Department of Public Utility rulemaking. And at the State House level, our goal is to have statewide legislation passed that's modeled on the Boston gas leaks ordinance. This is part of an overall statewide campaign I won't go into now, but just so you know, it fits into a broader campaign. Okay, so what else? Really quickly. We have a growing network across the country. We have 12,000 supporters. We have people, a part of Mothers Out Front from all 50 states. We have 57 countries represented. We're expanding like crazy. We've got mothers reaching out to us from all across the country. We have staff on the ground in Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia, and we're expanding into 10 more states in 2017. Here are the states and the towns. Fundamentally, we believe that engaged mothers have the opportunity to alter the political landscape in this country. Our vision is that tens and ultimately hundreds of thousands of mothers in communities all across the country are working at the local and statewide levels to protect their children from climate change, working on campaigns that move us from dirty to clean energy. And we look forward to hopefully working with many of you here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. One of the best-known issues in Canada has been the issue of tar sands, and how do we take on this enormous resource, these very large companies, and a great deal of government support and U.S. support as well, coming from the South. And involved in that is Ariel Derringer, who is the Communications Coordinator and Executive Assistant for the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation. You're on. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here.
Iklanete. Dene sutlene ta Ariel Tseekwe Hushe. My name is Ariel Tseekwe, and in my language that means Thunder Woman. And my language is Dene or Dene Sutlene. The name Chippewayan or Chippewan is actually a Cree word that was used to describe what we look like, and it means like pointy hats because we had caribou skins that made points at the end of our caps. But that's the colonial name that was given to us. I want to start today by first recognizing the Indigenous territories in which we reside on here today. And I want to thank the Indigenous tribes of Massachusetts and the oh my God, I'm going to butcher their name, Wampanoag people. I'm really bad at other people's names, and I feel really horrible. But I do want to recognize that we sit on the territories of Indigenous peoples, and those peoples have laid the foundations for where we are today. And I want to start my presentation by addressing Indigenous peoples wholly. This is a map created by the National Geographic Society, and it is actually a map of the world based on Indigenous tribes and territories. It's not a way we look at the world very often. And it's actually really unfortunate that we don't see the world this way, because many of us come from territories where there are recognized Indigenous peoples and Indigenous tribes. Right now, 5% of the global population is represented by Indigenous people. Roughly 370 million people in the world are identified as Indigenous peoples, as defined by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There are over 5,000 distinct groups in 90 different countries. They have their own political systems, their own languages, their own structures for education, health, and so on and so forth. What's really alarming about this fact is that there's roughly 5,000, but 5 years ago that number was 6,000. The languages and the groups that are disappearing at an enormous rate. What's really interesting about the facts of Indigenous peoples is that we occupy 22% of the world's land surface. That's in comparison to urban centers only occupying about 3 to 4%, and the land utilized for sustaining those areas is roughly about 10 to 15. So we occupy double what non-Indigenous folks occupy. And what's even more interesting on that top of that fact is 80% of the world's global biodiversity is encompassed within traditional lands and territories. That becomes a really critical thing to understand in the context of climate change and planetary health, because Indigenous peoples live within the world's most critical biodiversity, including in my people's traditional territory. And even one step further is 85% of the world's protected and conservation areas are on top of or adjacent to Indigenous territories. None of this is by coincidence. None of this is by coincidence, because Indigenous peoples have been fighting, challenging, and occupying their territories against some of the most oppressive measures taken globally to protect their lands and territory, because it is intrinsically a part of our identities and who we are as Indigenous peoples. Our cosmology, our belief systems are a part of the land, and the land is a part of us. Dene Sutlene, the name of my people, means of the land. Our traditional name before we were given Athabasca Chippewa First Nation is Kaitale Dene Sutlene, and it means of the willow of the land, in reference to the Athabasca Delta, in which the area where our people live. So my community now lives in the sleepy town of Fort Chipewyan. It's not a reservation. It's a hamlet. We have been lived there. We were forcibly removed because of dams in the 60s to live into this township. And this township is right there. So this is the Arctic line. Actually, I have another little, there's I don't have to point at it. So we're that far up north, and all this red blotches and marks on the map are where the oil sands or tar sands are. So we're downstream from the largest industrial project on the planet. So this is tar sands. It's not your sweet crude oil. It's more like peanut butter. And in 1995 is sort of when it took off, when it was considered economically viable at about 480,000 barrels. By 2008, 1.3. By 2020, they want to have about 3 million barrels per day in production. Again, it's not your typical sweet crude oil, so 20% of the oil sands is removed through open pit mining or open cast mining, while the other 80% is done through in situ or SAGD. Dr. David Schindler said that there's nothing on this planet that compares with the destruction going on there. If there were a prize for unsustainable development, the tar sands would be a clear winner. And I want to mention that we need more scientists like David Schindler to step up to the plate and stand alongside communities that are challenging some of the largest industrial projects on the planet. And these projects aren't just threatening climate, they're threatening the survival of people. In this case, it's my people. I'm not attached to this campaign because it's something that I felt for. It's something that is intrinsically a part of me. When I saw what was happening in my territory, it's literally like seeing someone destroy a relative, because that is who I am. I cannot stand idly by and let these companies continue to wreak havoc on my people and my territory. Development requires massive amounts of water to produce. And this water ends up in massive tailings ponds, which are more like lakes and now cover 260 square kilometers of land in the region. And there are studies that have indicated that about 11 million liters of toxic contaminants leach into the river systems every single day. The land that's being removed for this industry, they refer to it as overburden. We refer to it as the boreal forest, our traditional territory. And more dirt has been moved than for the Great Wall of China, the Suez Canal, the Great Pyramids of Cheops, and the 10 largest dams in the world combined. In situ, or steam-assisted gravity drainage, is the 80% of how it's going to be removed from the ground. It's kind of like fracking, but like fracking for a meth addict, because it's so intense and crazy because they're making it everywhere. So they superheat and they steam inject into the ground. Another set of pipes sucks up the sort of bitumen or the raw bitumen. But to give you an idea of how they're going to fragment and destroy the environment, this is the territory around Fort McMurray. Fort McMurray is up there. This is traditional territory of Cree and Dene people in the region. This is what it'll look like after they finish all of their lease sites. Total entire fragmentation of our ecosystems, disruption of migratory patterns of large mammals, breeding grounds for migratory birds and other species in the region, and also contamination and leaks into aquifers and water systems in the region. This is every multinational corporation in the world. This isn't one company that you can challenge. This is every company in the world. The people that are standing up and opposing these projects are small communities. My community, Fort Chipewyan, 1,200 people. 1,200 people are speaking out against the largest industrial project on the planet with interests from every multinational corporation in the world. The reason why it's called the largest project isn't because of the tar sands themselves, but because of the infrastructure that's associated with it, the massive pipelines and the refineries in the lower 48. And the fact that there are plans to continue this type of expansion and development of oil in other parts of the world. We cannot allow these projects to be considered viable, not for economic reasons or for the reasons for energy. We have to think about the human implications that are happening from these projects, which I want to touch on just a little bit before I get booted off. This is the Athabasca River system. It's the river that flows to our community. This is a tailings pond. This is pet coke, just laying on the shores. I don't have to explain this to you guys because you're all scientists. This river system literally is the water that our community drinks. It's the water that our fish swim in, that our ducks go in, that our animals drink from. It's our road, it's everything. It's the lifeline of our community, and this is just one project. There are currently 154 tar sands projects in Alberta. There are plans, there are 26 on the books now waiting for approval. And they want to they want to increase it by 40% by 2020. Before, boreal forests. Afterwards, equivalent land use capacity. This is what they call reclamation in our territory, less than 2%. The implications on climate are decreasing in our water systems where we can't access our traditional hunting grounds, 2014, 2015. The impacts on our lands and species, ducks land in the tailings ponds and die. 1,606 is the largest flock that died. Our fish, we're seeing enormous numbers of deformities, contamination, such high levels in a community that this is the main source of food and has been since time immemorial, fish. We have warnings in our community that now say that you should not eat fish if you are pregnant or under the age of 12, or you should limit your fish consumption to 1 fish a month. In addition to contamination, we have increase of poaching. This is a bison, and this bison was found beheaded in our territory. This bison could feed 4 families for an entire season, but instead somebody came in for trophy hunting because of this sort of regard or disregard for the land, or this ideology of man's domination over nature has become so pervasive in our territory and is an attempt to erase Indigenous ideologies of connectedness to the land. Climate change is going to impact all of us. Already we're seeing movements away from our ability to access our traditional foods, our traditional territory, making us reliant on food systems that we have to ship into our community, where a gallon of milk costs $17, $18, where a loaf of bread costs $8, where an apple, a singular, non-organic Macintosh apple, is $5. All of this is leading to a lot of the things we've all heard over the last couple days: obesity, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, so on and so forth in our communities. And this is all I have to say about tar sands. Like, honestly. And I do want to say one thing before I'm 3 minutes over already, is that we're in a time of unprecedented climate change on this planet, and yet one thing has remained the same: the marginalization of Indigenous peoples, the attempted erasure of our identities, our cosmologies, and who we are, and our knowledge systems. Yet at the international levels, we have recognition of our rights, our knowledge systems, our ability to self-determination and governance, and yet we continue to be marginalized on the sidelines. We do not have seats at the table determining how our lands and territories are used, how we'll be included in solutions that are being developed, and people don't understand that for centuries we have been systemically excluded and marginalized, and in some cases massive attempts of genocide have happened to our people. My ability to stand here today is a testament to the resiliency of Indigenous peoples, not just here in North America, but globally. We're still here, and we're still fighting for the protection and preservations of our lands and our ecosystems and our waterways, and the health and survival of our people. I want my children to know what it means to be Kaitale Dene Sutlene. And that's going to mean that the ecosystems in the Athabasca Delta need to be there. And my community is taking every avenue available by challenging within the legal systems, by participating in the regulatory systems, by asking for reform in the government, and by going out on the streets and protesting. There is not one single arrow that's going to solve this solution, but it's going to take all of us standing together to realize that we are all a part of the systems, that we are all Dene Sutlene, we are all of the land. Masicho, thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you. What? That was really great. Thank you. Ariel, what a powerful presentation and what an incredible example of the interconnectedness of the science, so many needed disciplines, and so much grassroots action to pull together. Thank you very much for being here. Our final panelist this morning is Courtney Howard. Courtney is an emergency physician from Yellowknife. She's the vice president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. She has been instrumental in organizing and pushing the Canadian government, which, as you all know, has changed significantly in the last 2 years. But she's been one of the catalysts, and she's going to describe to us much of the work that she's been able to do in terms of making a very large institution change. Courtney.
So I knew it was going to be tough going after Marshall Gans, and I also knew it was going to be tough going after Ariel. But in a way, it's really appropriate because I was actually inspired to become involved with this by the story of Ariel's community. I was sitting beside, this is the Mackenzie River downstream from where Ariel lives. I was preparing to go on a trip with MSF by working in the north, and I happened to pick up a book on the tar sands in the Edmonton airport, totally naive to environmental problems, and I was reading it while I was in the Mackenzie Delta, and wow, all of a sudden there was a whole new problem at my feet. I didn't know that climate change was a thing. I'd totally forgotten about it during my medical school training. And, I was like, oh, maybe someone solved that during my 12 years in a steady care. Apparently not. And, the tar sands were a problem. And so this part of the world is actually 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before. As Robin said, it has consequences for food security, cultural security, and transport, as well as mental health. And so basically, I went from there to Djibouti, where I spent 6 months resuscitating malnourished children, and that was where it really solidified for me. If you get fluids and antibiotics into a person who is tenuously stable, you can save them. If you're even a couple minutes or half an hour late and you do the same thing, it doesn't work and they die. And every clinician has had that experience at the bedside. And my read of the planet right now is that we are tenuously stable and we need to act right now to try to stabilize the system. If we are later, it won't work. And so I came back from that thinking, this is a big problem. And I thought, well, I'll just explain this to a lot of people and that's going to work really well. Well, yeah. People still came to my dinner parties, but that's only because I'm really good at making cake. So we've learned a lot about stories and evidence, and this is a hard truth for us. We've been taught that evidence is the way to go, and it's just not. So I managed to end up on the board of CAPE by sheer enthusiasm, not skill, and I came to the first board meeting and I said, I think we need to work on climate change. They were working on pesticides. And Gideon said, well, what's your target? I said, we need to save the planet together. And he said, you need a target. I was like, what? So I didn't know that had anything to do with anything. And now I do believe that this is actually the way change is made. You need a target. You need to win your target. And that helps you build the team. And all of that is done with stories. So I wanted to check this theory of change with someone who's actually been part of a super important nerdy movement, and this is Dr. Mary Wynne Ashford, who is the international president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And she confirmed, she said, we had a whole series of wins, and the more we succeeded, the bigger we got, and the more impact we made. So this means we need to learn new skill sets, and we're not going to get it right the first time, right? The home team is important. Please do give your first presentation at your home hospital or institution. That way, when you go out into the world, people aren't going to be surprised and they'll support you. You don't want to be a lonely advocate. This also means taking care of your home and your family. If you can take off a hat as you add this hat, things will go better for you. This means taking care of the little bit of nature you walk around in every day. Okay, it needs to be walked, it needs to be fed, it needs to be watered, or you're going to get sick and we need you. Okay, whoops, that was the wrong way. Okay, consider the mental health of your audience's team and staff. We have all been here. I have been in this position. Okay, reading Bill McKibben's article when I had a 6-month-old. I was around my 6-month-old. Okay, people who haven't encountered this information, it has huge impact on their psyches, and you need to keep that in mind. I used to do about a 90% problem, 10% solution presentation. I've gradually ratcheted that back to about 30-70, and I was talking to Nick one day, and he said he had to. And so really, this is what we need to do. We need to help people envision where we're going to so that they can start to slot themselves into that picture. Or you can just put funny slides in your presentation. That works too. I encourage that. Okay? So persistence has been getting some airtime lately, which is good. The change at the Canadian Medical Association, my initial totally naive motion was actually for the Canadian Medical Association to support increased peer-reviewed studies into the health impacts of the oil sands. And I thought to myself, who could argue with that? Doctors love evidence. Well, it turns out they could. And we had a big fight. And the good thing about a fight, conflict, it turns out, generates media coverage. We made newspaper headlines across the country, so there's a lesson. I was shell-shocked, but whatever. We came back the next year, had a bunch of climate health motions, did not pass. The year after that, we actually really kind of got funky. We had a paper mache globe. I brought my baby. I advise you to bring your baby when you're doing things, also puppies. We talked to everybody, and the motions actually passed. The most important thing we did was at this point we were getting them to take a look at divestment because the BMA had already voted to divest at this point, the British Medical Association, and we wanted to replicate that. And so I sat down with some of the vice presidents of MD Financial, who are the financial arm of the Canadian Medical Association, and they and explained to them about the carbon bubble. And at that point, they were naive to the concept. It was a few years ago. It wasn't talked about as much. Put them on the Carbon Tracker website. They were just like, is this legit? Is this legit? I said, yeah. This is legit. Do you see the logo where it says London School of Economics? Do you think those guys are legit? And we're like, mm-hmm. And so then about 2 minutes later, we were talking to the president of MD Financial, and from that point forward, we were crafting motions in association with them that they would be able to make action with, that actually made sense. And basically the next year, we had the motions ready with them. We voted to divest. It was close, but it passed. We voted for the CMA to also promote the health impacts of carbon pricing. Because I basically got up and read the Lancet quote, so thank you to everyone who contributed to that from the 2015 Commission. And they were like, okay, sure. By then, they were like, just do it. And the next year, James Urbinski, who's in the crowd here, came and gave our keynote on climate change and health. They confirmed that they had divested because they'd made a fossil-free fund, and they had transferred the CMA's money into that fund, and now that fund is available for other physicians to invest in. And thank you. And what was the coolest thing was that they're proud of it. Okay, this is the head of MD Financial, Brian Peters. This is the VP, Alison Seymour. They are proud of it. Like, this enabled them to give meaning to their work. So sometimes I feel like we're making an ask and we feel scared to do that, but it's an offering also. Everybody wants to help with this, and if you can help other people figure out how to do that within their realm of achievement, that's an offering. We've done a lot of work with CAPE on coal phase-out, and I think this is a really good target for you in the U.S. You can do it locally. This is all done based on asthma. So we've done this with big health coalitions. In Ontario, we managed to actually phase out all of the coal power. So that's a 30 megaton savings, which is the largest single greenhouse gas reduction maneuver in North America. We transferred that same plan to Alberta and ended up getting a commitment to coal phase out in Alberta. Alberta is the province that Ariel lives in. This is the most right-wing province in Canada. But when you talk about asthma and you have imagery of kids with puffers and you have stats associated with the morbidity and mortality, that's what changes opinions. Who tells the story? We've asked this a lot. Opinion surveys say that people trust doctors, scientists, and nurses actually topped this last year more than anyone else. So I say we try to do that. And so give everybody media training. Every single person, give them media training. See who's good at it. If they're not good, stop. right? So aspects of this are make you feel silly. Okay, I felt super silly getting these photos taken. This was for a article in the Canadian Family Physician. James Orbinski was there, and he actually said, I said, James, I feel really silly getting my photo taken. And he said, Courtney, it's part of the job. And then I laughed, and that's when they took this picture. Offer kudos to colleagues. This is Katie Gibbs. She started Evidence for Democracy in Canada. She started it with this brilliant protest. It was the death of evidence. They carried a coffin to Parliament Hill. All the scientists were wearing their lab coats. Costumes, story, drama. Look at this. She followed this up by founding an organization that she currently heads. She went from being a PhD to being the executive director of this, and she's pushed this through. There's actually now a science parliamentary monitor person that they've created more or less because of a result of this advocacy. When you're picking your own target, sometimes it's easy to join people who are already doing things. There's a divestment campaign at every single university pretty much in this country, and many of them are not yet benefiting from having the voice of health at their side. Go find them. They're going to teach you so many advocacy skills you didn't even know about. Again, multidisciplinary teams are key. How do you find these people? I was lucky to go to the Social Change Institute, which is where I met Ariel. And there are people here with jobs I didn't even know. They analyze social media, figure out who opens things, like look at photos online, which ones do people click on. We need to figure this stuff out. We need, between ourselves, to find an online way of better connecting. I don't care what platform it is, but we need to find one, and we need to all be on the same one so we can access ourselves. I believe that lack of cool people is still our biggest problem. So to access cool people, we either need to make new friends, which, is good, or we need money. I think this is probably faster, but we need some of that. We managed to, under our new executive director, Kim Parada, transfer this countrywide. So we decided to go for Canadian coal phase-out. Joe Vipon was really the mastermind behind this. We recruited doctor advocates from all of the different provinces, and 9 months later, with the help of a whole bunch of behind-the-scenes environmental NGOs. We knew all of the NGOs in each community who are most key to this. We had monthly teleconferences where we talked about who knew what, and, the minister said this, and we heard the announcements coming then. Coordinated op-eds so we weren't in competition with one another, and about 9 months later, with the opportunity of a government that listens to evidence and is looking for social license to make the climate maneuvers that they believe need to happen, managed to win this. And this is Joe Vipon, who's really spearheaded a lot of this. Now we're working on fracking in BC. We have a physician community in BC who's looking at fracking. We need to interact with resource extraction. I haven't heard a lot about resource extraction, but if we need to leave 90% or 80% of fossil fuels in the ground, especially when there's toxic effects on vulnerable communities in British Columbia, it's Aboriginal people in the northeastern part of the province. Physicians are starting to work on that. We need to figure out what images are best. Do we do Facebook message testing? How do we get the data on the audiences we need to target to be most effective? These are the things we need to figure out. We need to learn how to be better allies to our Aboriginal people, and if they're in a place like Standing Rock, we need to go stand beside them. Témoignage is a feature of the MSF movement that I believe is really important, and basically it's about speaking truth to power in the pursuit of justice. Since I worked with MSF, this has been something I've carried through with me into my environmental work, and I think that this is important because we're going to be in contact with a lot of vulnerable communities, and I think that we owe it to them. Bottom line, what story are we telling ourselves? So are we saying if we don't transition quickly to a sustainable way of life, humanity is doomed? Or are we saying we are transitioning to a more sustainable and resilient way of life that will offer tremendous benefits to humanity? I wasn't a great competitive gymnast, but I had Olympic level coaching, and I know which message they would have told me to put in my head before I went into competition. So bottom line, it's about building the team, which is what we're doing here and what we're starting. It's about learning to set targets, which have been identified in a lot of the research, and it's about winning and telling stories. And I just want to thank you because I've been so inspired by you this weekend, and I look forward to all the work we're going to do together.
Courtney, that is a terrific and what a wonderful panel. We're running a little bit late. Gina McCarthy is here and has agreed that if we slip a little, about 10 more minutes, that would be all right with her. I want to just underscore one final point. This is not easy work. This is very, very hard work. It is persistent, persistent, persistent. I would remind us that right here in our own backyard, Harvard University refuses to look at a policy on investments that will reference divesting. They refuse to do so, bragging about the research they're doing, the training that they're doing, how the facilities at Harvard are becoming more climate resistant and so on, but refusing to make consistent their investment policy with what else happens in the university. It's remarkable. Of all the places in the world, that is an indication, it seems to me, of how hard this is, how much work we have to do, but also it's a great target, and we're going to knock that down. Anyway, we've got about 10 minutes, and I'll do 2 questions at a time. If people come to a microphone, we'll put 2 together, two quick questions, get the panel to reflect on those, and do a couple more over here, and we'll be done. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Natalia Linu from UNDP. Thank you. It has been a really wonderful panel. My question is, what is your honest opinion of the term planetary health? Can that help us mobilize sort of support? And also to your point, Courtney, about setting targets, is it better to say we as a community will support the climate change work and the pollution work, like set a few targets? I mean, the interests are really diverse in this room.
Great question.
How do you
ahead.
advise?
Hi, Federico from Colombia. I recently moved to Canada, and something that I find very scary is that in Colombia we feel that Canadians do things well and they're super green. So when a mining company comes to Colombia, it's a Canadian company, this is going to be fine. So I just have questions about how are you networking with organizations in South America that are dealing with the same issues but with less organized controls, and it's very hard to deal with that in those contexts. Thank you.
Okay. Let's come over here, and then we'll go to the panel. Okay, I'll ask Sam to give us a quick summary of that on the first question. Let's go over here, and then we'll go to the panel. Go ahead.
First off, thank you so much to Ariel for your message. I'm also an Indigenous woman, and I just really, really appreciate what you're doing and seeing you here in a setting like this. I'm Lauren from Cornell. And I was wondering if you have any advice on how to humanize climate change and connect these human implications to a history of oppression, and how to empower Indigenous communities and around the world.
Okay, panel, let me pick and choose from the questions that were answered, and let's just start. Marshall, do you want to start, and we'll just roll right down? We'll wind up with you. Okay, so go the other direction. Who wants to start?
I can just start with the last question. I think that over the last 5 years, there's been a huge movement, or a shift rather, in the environmental movement, and an intersectionality of not just environmental movement focusing on just the environment and bringing in both science and human stories together. And I think that that's been happening pretty good. But there also needs to be a review and a shift of what Marshall was talking about, which is power. And how do we shift the dynamics of power and start to create forms of equity? We talk a lot of rhetoric about that, but the reality is that Indigenous people still lack access to resources, and most importantly, lack access to power. Even within the UNFCCC climate negotiations, Indigenous peoples, although we are sort of recognized as important players in developing climate change mitigation adaptation strategies, we have no seat at the table. We have no power other than lobbying state leaders that have the power. And so we have to move towards fundamentally shifting how Indigenous people are able to access resources and sit in positions of having meaningful impact on decisions. We talk about science influencing policy, but Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge also needs to be at the table with them. And we need to empower communities to not only understand that, but it's hard. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years of systemic and institutional oppression and marginalizations, attempted erasure of culture and identity through residential and boarding schools in Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries where we saw this attempted erasure and assimilation into our society. And so there's a lot of undoing that has to happen with that. And there's a lot of people that need to wake up. They wake up.
Courtney, do you want to take a shot?
Sure. So I personally think the term planetary health is really useful. I think it's something that people understand intuitively, and I think that that helps. And I suppose the only thing would be to proceed into this space with some humility. That's what I didn't say. There's a lot of people who have been in this space for decades. Trevor Hancock in Canada says that the environmental movement has been doing the work of public health for decades, and we need to acknowledge that. They've been doing our job. So as we move in, we can't steamroller in. We have to go, we have to assess, we have to see what people have to say. Same thing with the Indigenous peoples who have been doing the work of public health for millennia, really. And so I think the planetary health term is useful. In terms of targets, I think that a lot of it is going to be local. But what I think we need to get much better at is replicating wins. So if something works here, let's communicate and do the same thing here and here and here and here, much like what Mothers Out Front is doing. I think coal's a really good target. I really think we need to look at fracking. The evidence base has come along, and unfortunately none of it's good. And we need to be interacting with that.
That leads to you, Kelsey.
So I also think that the planetary health frame is a very useful one, and I also think it is important to localize. So, for example, when we're working on climate change, if we're talking to mothers, working with mothers in Hampton Roads, Virginia, we're talking about sea level rise, because that's what they're experiencing. When we're talking to mothers in Southside Williamsburg, where we have a partnership with El Puente, we're talking about asthma. When we're talking to mothers in Boston, we're talking about gas leaks. So in the overall frame, yes, is climate change. And so you can use an overall frame of planetary health, but just being very cognizant on who your audience is, who you're trying to engage, and how you make this set of issues speak to them and connect it with their personal experience, I think is very important.
Marshall, closing the panel.
Yeah, I guess we all think planetary health is good, right? Good. Right? Yeah. Okay, good. That's settled. No, I think it's important to this may seem a little tangential, but I think it's important to recognize something. An old friend, Tom Hayden, who's active in the anti-war movement, once said, "Change is slow except when it's fast." We're in a fast moment right now, certainly in this country, and I think in much of the world. There is a fluidity in public institutions, in the reaction to challenges that are unlike those we've experienced before, certainly in this country, from the administration. And the response, whether it's 7,000 indivisible groups or students at the Kennedy School put together a resistance school and had a session last week attended by 40,000 people online, there is a moment right now to engage. And I think that people are ready to engage, but I think they are desperate to figure out how and to find the pathways. And I think the challenge for those of us that see where change needs to go is to create those pathways and to extend those invitations and to come up with those approaches. And whenever we were designing campaigns, we always thought there were three elements. You have to have the story. That's why it matters, why we care. That's the humanizing. That's the whole values part. But we also have to have the strategy. What's our power strategy? How are we going to influence these targets that we have? Is it civil disobedience? Is it political? What is it? And thirdly, how do we organize ourselves to do it? And that is not minimal. That's significant, because how we organize ourselves determines whether we have the venues within which to strategize, and to strategize with each other. Not just in isolated little pockets here and there, But creativity and strategy comes from a merging of different kinds of perspectives and experience. And so I think that's where the challenge lies. It's time to get going on that, I think.
Maybe the Planetary Health Alliance will have a session soon on the urgency of now and more of what can be done and how to do it. This has been a terrific panel, and we thank all four of you very much for your great participation. Sam?